How can you write a novel that can't be put down? George R.R. Martin may have a few secrets to teach us. This is going to be a two-part video. It may appeal to serious Game of Thrones fans, but my hope is that it will be of special interest to writers in pursuit of gripping fiction, no matter what the genre. This first video will focus on the prologue, and the next will focus on chapter 1. In both videos, I'll be trying to isolate some of the specific techniques that Martin used to make A Game of Thrones such an irresistible page-turner. Here's a setup. We're in a forest, in a cold northern place with a group of armed men looking for something. And here we get our first infusion of narrative drive in the form of a point of view character experiencing a sense of dread. There was an edge to this darkness that made his hackles rise. A cold wind was blowing out of the north, and it made the trees rustle like living things. All day, Will had felt as though something were watching him, something cold and implacable that loved him not. I like to call this kind of thing shadow description. If you want to harken back to high school English, you could also call it foreshadowing. Whatever you want to call it, I found that it's a hugely important element in gripping fiction. Here's another example. A cold wind whispered through the trees. His great sable cloak stirred behind him like something half alive. Something half alive. Half alive is also half dead, right? The men of this little armed group don't like their commander, who is a spoiled young lordling. Eventually, this feeling goes from an undercurrent to an actual outbreak of open conflict. And this is the second ingredient of narrative drive we find in Martin's prologue. Dramatic conflict from potential to actual. One of the men, out scouting, comes upon a group of strangers that look like they're frozen to death. But the weather hasn't really been all that cold. Raises a question in our minds, doesn't it? Here we have a third element of narrative drive, mystery. And finally, we have action. All of a sudden, it gets really cold. Pale shapes come gliding through the forest. There's a sword fight. The lordling is killed. And then, of course, it gets worse. One thing to notice about George Martin's action scenes, and one of the things that makes them so good, is that they're defamiliarized. Are you familiar with this word? Well, let me give you an example. Defamiliarization. When the blades met, there was no ring of metal on metal, only a high, thin sound at the edge of hearing, like an animal screaming in pain. Do you see this? This action is defamiliarized because it takes something we're very familiar with, the ring of clashing swords, and it turns it into something strange or slanted. Martin accomplishes this by introducing an easily imagined sound that is itself charged with dread. In other words, a sound that is deeply imbued with the first element that we looked at, shadow description. So, in sum, we have shadow description, potential and actual dramatic conflict, and defamiliarized action, all stacked on top of each other and sometimes mixed together. Such is Martin's recipe, at least in the prologue, for that holy grail of the fiction writer, compulsive readability. If you enjoyed this little video, stay tuned for part 2, in which we'll be looking at more page-turning special effects in A Game of Thrones, chapter 1. Meanwhile, I encourage you to check out the rest of my short video series, The Fiction Chronicles, which is available for free for you to view at your own leisure on my YouTube page at timweed.2. Have a great day.